Welcome to the Jazz Film Room podcast. I am your host, Ben Dowsett, in a tropical location, also known as my bedroom. I am joined by my good friend and the person who will likely be the most frequent guest on this podcast moving forward. You all know him. He is Dan Clayton, the managing editor of Salt City Hoops. Dan, how you doing, man?
Hey, it's good to be here, Ben. I wish I was somewhere tropical like you. Mine just looks like a basement because it's a basement.
Today I decided to go further and get the overlay. Plus, it makes my hair look crazy. I don't know if people can
I
see
know.
this as
Well,
I move.
I mean,
The hair
let's be
already looks
honest.
crazy.
Your hair makes your hair look crazy. So, let's start with that. But yeah, it does. It sort of creates a cloud around the outer edges of your poof ball hair. So it's pretty cool. Yeah.
I'm sticking.
It's kind of like whenever I take a player's image and do the remove background thing so I can turn it into a graphic or whatever. It's really hard if it's Donovan Mitchell or some guy with dreads or some guy or some white dude with poofy hair. That's what your hair is like right now. It is a Photoshop challenge is what it is.
I love it. Yeah. And it makes it look more afro-y. So I'm here for it because I like when it looks afro-y. Anyway, moving past my hair, this is the second straight podcast we've begun the podcast.
Well, I mean, it's the elephant in the room.
It really is. I really want to, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I really want to cut it, but I'm kind of terrified to get a haircut in Utah right now. Anyway, on to basketball. So Dan and I are going to cover several things here. First of all, he recently wrote, in fact, that was yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday. It will play on Thursday. On Tuesday, Dan published an excellent comprehensive look at Rudy Gobert's contract situation. As many in-depth fans are well aware, Rudy's got, as of the time this comes out, about 4 days left to sign the supermax contract. However, as we'll get into, that's not the only contract he can sign. And then we're also going to dig into some other stuff, some of our thoughts from the preseason so far, which I think has had quite a few things to dissect. We're going to maybe break down our thoughts on the kind of the 9 through 12 rotation. I think pretty much everyone who pays attention to this team knows who the top 8 guys are in the rotation as long as everyone's healthy. But then from there, it's a really interesting conversation about who fits where, if guys get injured, who takes their spot, that sort of thing. And so we'll get into that as well. But I did want to start with Dan's piece on Rudy Gobert, which was fantastic. And I'm not even the first local podcast to shout it out. He got a shout out from David Locke, who is a much bigger deal than me. So yeah, thank you to David for that on Dan's behalf. So Dan, first of all, I will direct folks to Salt City Hoops where they can read this piece. It's still up on the homepage right now, I believe. And I'll put something in the video pod to make sure that you can get there. You can find more details on what I'm about to ask Dan in the piece. So if you really want to get as specific as possible, just go there. However, for the listener's sake, Dan, can you just tell us the very basics of what's on the table for Rudy? What is the minimum and maximum that the Jazz can offer? When can they offer it? I know that the answer to this is a little more complex than I'm making it sound because there are a few contract templates they can offer him. But in the simplest terms you can, lay it out to us what the Jazz and Rudy's options are, both before the 21st and then if they get to the 21st without a deal.
Sure. Yeah. The reason I'm laughing is because we don't know what's actually on the table. We don't know what the Jazz are putting on the table. Here's what Rudy is eligible for. Because he's been an all-NBA player in 2 seasons, because he's been a defensive player of the year in 2 different seasons, Rudy is eligible for what they call the supermax, which just means that he can sign an extension with a higher starting salary and an additional year. So between now and next, what is the 21st? Monday, Tuesday? I guess it's Monday. Yeah.
We'll guess. I'm not even going to click and look.
Yeah. Okay. So between now and December 21st, he can set, which is the day before the NBA regular season starts, he can sign a contract for up to, and I want to be clear about up to, he can sign for up to 5 years and $227 million.
So basically the deal we just saw Giannis Antetokounmpo sign with the Bucks.
Basically, yeah. It doesn't have to be that. It can be, if they want to sign him to a 5-year extension, it does have to be at least $195 million, because because to get that extra year, you have to use the supermax clause in the collective bargaining agreement. And that means giving him at least 30% of next year's cap, which, if you project that out with the raises he would get, comes to about 5 years, $195 million. That is a boatload of money. What they can also do between now and December 21st, and actually what they can still do after that, is they can still sign him to a non-supermax deal, a regular veteran extension that would be for up to 4 years and up to 151 million. However, I think it's pretty unlikely that he takes that deal, because the second he becomes a free agent, any other team can come give him a 4-year, $144 million deal, which is only $7 million different than what the Jazz could offer as a regular veteran extension without using the supermax. And I just think that $7 million difference, I don't think there's incentive for him to take that deal between December 22nd and whenever free agency starts. So
And
I
doesn't
think,
that, sorry to cut you off, don't
please.
the Jazz also get the option to offer him a larger contract in the summer once the offseason hits?
Exactly.
Again, the largest contract they can offer him is now the supermax. But if we get past the 21st, then we enter into a period where the max they can offer him isn't as high as the max that they could then offer him in the subsequent summer.
They can only go up to that 4 and 151 million until free agency opens. And then once again, he's eligible for that 5-year, 227, up to the 5 and $227 million, but only from the Jazz. So there's just not a lot of incentive for him to take that something that isn't at least somewhere in the supermax range, right? Like, I think he's going to be negotiating hard to try to get the 5th year, which means somewhere between 195 million and 227 million. I think that's obviously what Rudy's camp is after. And again, what the Jazz have to compete against, at least in theory, we don't know that there's going to be a team offering him a max deal, but we know that 6 to 9 teams are going to have cap space. And a lot of the guys that would have led next summer's free agent class, like Giannis and like Paul George, have already signed extensions. So Rudy is going to be high on the free agency radar next summer, and a team could offer him 144 million. So the Jazz, I think that's the sort of bird in the bush offer. We don't know that that's there, but I think that's what they sort of have to negotiate against in Rudy's mind.
So yeah, I've thought about that as well. And I think I was tweeting about it the other day. Do we think that, so, the fact that other players have signed, like Giannis and PG, as you mentioned, one might think, oh, that's bad for the Jazz because it puts Rudy higher up on the list of potential free agents. My counter to that is generally, if it comes down to money, the Jazz win. If this is about money, even and this is not reporting. I don't think either of us is reporting much of anything here. Informed speculation, perhaps, but I even if the Jazz are not offering the full supermax, which it would be done if they were, they're not. They can still, and I think are comfortable paying him significantly more than any other team will have the ability to offer him. So if it comes down to money, I do think Rudy wins. Let me ask you one thing, and this is something you were explaining to me recently that I think is an interesting route. And I wonder, again, not reporting, I just wonder if the Jazz might have interest in this route, and maybe it's why the negotiations are taking a little longer, because it's complex. So there is the possibility of incentives for Rudy's contract based on his performance. So we know, for instance, Donovan Mitchell has the incentive on his contract this upcoming season. If he makes any of the All-NBA, it's a really huge season, because if he makes any of the 3 All-NBA teams just this season, not in any of the subsequent seasons, just this one, he then, boom, his contract jumps up to that 195 million designated player range. Rudy, I believe you were telling me they have a bit more flexibility in terms of how they could do that. They could maybe tier it based on which of the All-NBA teams he made, or here's what happens if you win Defensive Player of the Year again. Can you give a brief primer to the folks on what that would be and how they might be able to structure it there to where his performance can get him paid even more?
Yeah, and just like for clarity's sake, and not to be like an overly like to be overly nerdy about it, but it's different from an incentive. So an incentive tends to refer to like a yearly trigger that a player can hit. Like Rudy's current contract has an incentive where he gets paid, I think it's $1 million extra in any season of his current contract where he makes the All-Star team. That's an incentive. This would be written into the contract language as setting the first year salary, and then the rest of the contract would follow based on what the first year was, right? Because the raises in a player contract from year to year are based on what the first year salary was. So, again, most players with Rudy's level of experience are eligible for up to 30% of the max, because 30% of the salary cap rather, because Rudy is supermax eligible because of those things he's accomplished in his career. He's eligible for up to 35% of the salary cap, But what the Jazz can do, and what Miami did with Bam Adebayo most recently, or most notably perhaps, is Miami said, now for Bam it was different. He's a younger player, so for him the band was 25% to 30%, and they basically said, okay, we're going to guarantee you 25% of the salary cap as a starting salary. If you make all NBA third team, we'll bump that to 26.5. If you make second team, we'll bump that to 27.5. If you make the first team or win MVP or defensive player of the year, we'll give you the whole 30%. The Jazz could do something like that with Rudy, right? They could say, hey, based on this coming season, if you make third team all NBA, we'll give you 32% of the salary cap. We'll bump it to 33% if you make second team, and if you repeat as defensive player of the year or make first team, we'll give you the whole 35%. That's an option. Now, if I'm Rudy, they're explaining that to me, and in my mind, I might be thinking, what are you talking about? I already unlocked the 35% by what I've already accomplished. Why do I have to clear that hurdle again to get money that I've already sort of, not locked in, but money that I've already
earned the right to, at least.
Yeah, earned the right to, right? He has earned the right to negotiate for up to that amount. And so for them to put those hurdles in his way, he might take that personally. But I do think, and David made this point this morning, like I think Rudy probably understands he's not getting $227 million at the end of this negotiation. I think he probably knew that going in. I wrote in my piece that I wouldn't blame the Jazz based on his impact if they went all the way there, but I don't think they want to. I don't think they should. I don't think they can with the rest of their salary construct. So I think Rudy gets that. And I think that could be a way for the Jazz to try to say, hey, we want to reward your impact. We know you're really good. Let's just, let's take this season and how good you are this season heading into the new contract to really decide how lucrative this next phase of your career is going to be. That's an option.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by that potential, and thank you for clarifying. It's more of a trigger, less of an incentive. And as you noted, it's a 1-year thing only, like Donovan for this upcoming year.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned it, I think David did a really good job. His chocolate chip cookie analogy of where the Jazz, despite the fact that they can offer, as I already said, more money than anybody else, easily, like they can not make their max offer and still easily beat what any other team is offering. It still feels like they're offering less because they are offering less than they could, that's part of what's so fraught about the supermax system. There's a lot of people that don't like it. In certain ways, I'm one of them. Just as far as like the Jazz shouldn't be at a disadvantage, quote unquote, because they don't want to go that full way, but yet they're still offering him more than anyone else. That should be viewed as an advantage, not a disadvantage.
Yeah, I agree. I said that when the Supermax started. I felt like the Supermax was going to be the way that especially small market superstars charged their existing teams a premium for staying. And that's the way it's played out. And look, it also kept Giannis in Milwaukee, and that's a win for small market teams. So I'm not there's a good side to be argued as well. But yeah, the Jazz, if the Jazz offer him the lowest amount they can offer him using the Supermax criteria, the 5th year, and the lowest max they can give him and still give him the 5th year, that would be $50 million and change better than the best possible offer any team could bring him next summer in free agency, $50 million. Now, where it gets tricky is then there's this big gap. The Jazz can't offer him any number between 195 and 151.
That's also stupid. If I can just say that,
it is a little bit.
Just have a structure where they can go in the middle somewhere there, because frankly, I think the ideal value for him is right there in the middle somewhere. Like 180 over 5 years would be pretty ideal to be able to give him, but they can't do that.
Yeah. So that makes this a little tricky. Is, do you stay down at the 150, the 4 years, 151? In which case, you're only beating the Bird and the Bush offer, the potential free agency offer. You're only beating that by $7 million. Is $7 million enough? And is the security enough that Rudy says, screw it, I'll sign for 151, right? After that, the next number that is available to them is 195 million over 5 seasons because of the specific parameters about what you have to do if you're gonna offer that 5th year at all. So That's a pretty big chasm. It sounds like Tony Jones said on a podcast recently that he thinks the Jazz are in mentally, that he thinks they're in the 200 range somewhere, which means that they're probably trying to get him on a supermax deal, but at the low end of the supermax range. And I think that, again, look, that's fair. It's uncomfortable for the Jazz over the next couple of seasons. As Donovan Mitchell gets his raise too. But I think that's the problem, is that there's this chasm of, we can go up to 151, they say, or we can start again, they say, at 195, and anything in between is this no man's land for them.
Yeah, not a fan of that. And I would agree with you that the low end of that supermax area, I mean, you can look at the 538 projection systems for player value, for instance, which aren't perfect. I just used those last week when I assessed the Jazz's offseason signings. They say Rudy's 5-year market value is in the $200 million range as far as the value he generates on the court. When, and David also mentioned, sorry to keep going back to David, you did a really good pod this morning. We're going to keep referencing it. He mentioned that there's almost a sense of within the league of, I lost my train of thought where I was going on that. I'm so sorry to the listeners. But the point I was essentially trying to make is Rudy, okay, I'm sorry, I'm doing really badly here, losing my train. But the reason why, and I'll go back to the not incentives, triggers that we mentioned, is that at least it makes the fraughtness of this a little less, it makes it easier to swallow. So as I noted with Donovan, if he hits that trigger this year and makes one of the All-NBA teams, that means he's beaten out several really good guards. The NBA's guard list is stacked up right now. It probably means the Jazz had a really good season, and that's going to make eating his extra salary that they have to deal with a lot more manageable. I see a similar theme with Rudy potentially if they attach some of those triggers we mentioned, where it's like, okay, if we do end up having to pay you 33, 34% of the salary cap here, it's because you won an award or you were the first team All-NBA center. And if that happens, it probably means the Jazz were really good. So that's why I'm into that. And I was going to ask for your prediction, which again, we're not reporting anything here. I would vaguely predict that they try something like that because the Jazz are very good in their salary cap department. Steven Schwartz is excellent. He does really good work. And I feel like they've exhausted all their avenues in terms of like looking for creative ways to do this. And I think if they do arrive at a solution before the 21st, I think it's going to involve that. Purely speculative.
Yeah, it very well could. Look, my broad prediction is I do still think a deal gets done. I think that there's an obvious middle ground here that's mutually beneficial, especially based on Tony's hunch. I don't know. I won't speak for Tony on whether that's a hunch or reporting on his side. I can't remember how he characterized it in that podcast, but based on him saying that he thinks the Jazz are okay in the low end of the supermax range, I just think, man, $200 million is a pretty funny amount of money to turn down. You know what I mean?
What if something happens with Rudy this year? God forbid, like nobody's hoping for that. But what if what if you have a crappy year? We kind of forget there were moments last year. He was good overall, but he didn't have, I don't think he was peak Rudy last year. I'm excited about what I'm seeing from him so far this year. We're going to talk about that later, but like, you never know, stuff can happen. Like when there's $200 million looking at you, I think I agree with you.
Yeah, well, and not just like, that he might have a down year or whatever. Cause like, I agree with you that he had some down stretches. I think, overall it was still, the Jazz still got peak Rudy, right? In a macro sense, top 15 and all these metrics that I mentioned in my piece, still ridiculously valuable, et cetera, et cetera. But, I was looking for a photo the other day and I was going through some stuff and I stumbled across, totally accidentally, the photo where Boris Diaw and Brian Zettler, former Jazz center, former Jazz trainer, are carrying Rudy off the floor after he tore his MCL in, I guess it was Boston. And the look on Rudy's face, like there's just this devastation and he's just staring into nowhere, but he's searching and I wonder, and like, I don't mean to get too poetic or Shakespearean about this, but like, that's the thing that I wonder how much of that is in the back of Rudy's mind, right? Because we've seen DeMarcus Cousins was an all NBA center and tore his Achilles and came back and is very much not an all NBA center now. Now he's fighting for guaranteed money in training camp and may or may not make he's probably going to make the roster, but my point stands. Like, stuff happens, and these guys are not impervious to all the things that, the father time can do to us and that injuries can do to us. And so, I do think that there is something to be said for the security of putting your name to paper and knowing that come hell or high water, you've got $200 million coming your way over 5 years, which again is 50 million plus more than this, proverbial bird in the bush that might be out there that he might be able to get next summer, but maybe not. And so I think that that's going to talk to him at some point, which is why, again, I think that he and the Jazz will find middle ground. It's just, it is tricky emotionally because the Jazz are not, it sounds as though the Jazz are not offering the most they can, which there might just be some emotional baggage to that, right? Like even though they're offering a lot and more than anyone else is offering, the fact that they're saying, oh, well, we could give you 35% of next year's cap. Let's give you 32 instead. Like, maybe that bugs him. I don't know. I don't know his mindset well enough to know. But, I think that's why it's tricky and perhaps less straightforward than other max contract extensions. Everyone knew Milwaukee was going to give Giannis every penny they could and pray to God to thank him for the right to do so. This one is a little trickier, not because Rudy isn't in that same ballpark value-wise, but because, the 35% is a big number for a big man whose value is delivered in a different context than Antetokounmpo's.
Yeah, I think that's all pretty good context there. I think we're both in a pretty similar mind about what we think will happen. I don't think anybody really knows at this point. Once again, guys, go to Salt City Hoops and read Dan's piece for far more detail, not just on the contract options, but on why Rudy himself is worth that, which we really didn't get into much here. Dan and I have written, talked, tweeted ad nauseum about the subject, so I'm sure you can find it. But Dan did a very good job in that piece. I wanted to transition now to a bit of our thoughts on the preseason that we have been seeing. I think for 2 games, again, we're recording this on Wednesday, so the Jazz's 3rd preseason game has not happened yet. I think for 2 preseason games, one where the starters only played about half the game, or the main guys at least, there's actually quite a bit for us to look at and kind of break down here. And with all the normal caveats about preseason, although I think people have overcorrected on that. Like, I think the idea that preseason means nothing is wrong. Preseason doesn't mean as much as all other game formats in the NBA, but it doesn't mean nothing, at least in my opinion. So there's a couple things I wanted to ask about. And the first is this pace increase that we've seen from the Jazz.
Yeah.
They're moving, and pace, when we talk about it, it's not just how quick is your possession or how many possessions are you playing in a game. We're also talking about tempo. How quickly are you getting shots up? Are you taking advantage of early opportunities to find creases in the defense? The Jazz have really pushed that this offseason. We saw this preseason. We saw during that 3rd quarter in the 2nd game against Phoenix on Monday, where they were shooting. I think there were several possessions in a row where they shot before the shot clock was at 15. Transition threes. Bojan even kicked out from a transition layup to Mike to shoot a transition 3.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Ingles did the same thing, kicking out of a layup to pass to Bojan, who missed a transition 3. But this is also not the first time we've seen this emphasis before. And I've thought back to previous preseasons. I haven't looked at the exact pace numbers, but Quinn, it's always been a subject that he's talked about. And then as the years gone on, Joe Ingles is on the roster. He's not the fastest guy in the world. Rudy is great, but he's not, and he gets up and down the floor, but he's not, Marquise Chris or somebody like that. You go down the roster and it never ends up working out that way. Do you think that this year's team can actually maintain that, not just pace, but the whole tempo theme? Because I think it's really potentially valuable for their offense.
It's like NBA preseason bingo free space. The whole we're gonna run fast. It's not just a Jazz thing that we hear about every fall, or in this case winter. But every training camp, it's every team that said, "Oh, of course we're gonna try to pick up the pace." I think this is maybe the most we've seen that training camp talking point hit the floor in terms of Riley Gisselman, who's amazing and brilliant and a good basketball eye and a good statistician. He tweeted something about 13% of the Jazz's preseason shots so far are 3-pointers in the first 5 seconds of the shot clock or something like that. I might be getting the details wrong because I'm working from memory here. Like, that is impressive. That means that there is a concerted effort to not just play faster, but to make but to create and leverage an advantage faster, right? And that's the whole thing. Quinn Snyder, ever since he's been the Jazz coach since 2014, his big thing has been, and you hinted at this, it's not about a number of possessions, it's about the speed of decision making, right? Like, that's what Quinn wants to see, is a reduction in the amount of time it takes a player to recognize that, oh, I'm about to catch the ball and here comes the defender towards me, so I'm going to catch and go instead of catch and shoot. Or, oh, here comes the ball and the player's coming this way, but my player's coming this way, so I'm going to screen. Like, the ability to recognize actions and attack that advantage in a split second is way more important than how quickly the shot goes up. But the fact that the shots have been going up so quickly in training camp tells me that this is something that Quinn is really hammering in on and really focused on.
I also
we'll
think
see if there's an efficiency cost. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's also, you and I have talked specifically, I think we've talked on a podcast before about the quote unquote fluff in Snyder's offense that can come. I think part of this emphasis, and this is slightly informed speculation here, is I think there's been more of an emphasis on, okay, guys, this is not fluff. Because when run at full speed, the stuff that we refer to as fluff is not. It's stuff that puts the defense off balance. It starts that half step of advantage that you're talking about. And I think that a lot of the emphasis from Quinn has been, we can't run any of that stuff at half speed. Every play from the moment it starts, even if your initial screen or your initial cut to that corner isn't the real action, even if that's a decoy for what's really coming, you have to do it at 100% as if it's the real thing. And when everything's executed with that kind of precision, all of a sudden the fluff is actually advantageous offense. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I remember talking to Quinn on one of their New York trips a couple of years. I used to, when I was living in New York, I would get credentialed often for the Jazz games in MSG and Barclays. And I remember talking to him and the guys before a Knicks game about, I was talking about blind pig action specifically, but the question, which is, when the ball goes to the big man at the free throw line extended, and they sort of punish an overplay by relaying a pass to a back cutting wing. And so I was talking about that, but more than anything, I was kind of saying, like, you have all these actions that you've been building into the offense, but you haven't been weaponizing them. And then suddenly at this point, a couple of years ago, this was still when Hayward was around and whatever, suddenly they were starting to weaponize them. And I think that's where the fluff comes in, is I think Quinn has been trying over several years to sort of build a muscle memory in these guys on what certain actions look like. But now he's realizing, or perhaps has realized all along, and now he's sort of graduating his team from, okay, let's run these 4 actions stacked on top of one another. Now he's saying, okay, you don't need to do that anymore. You run this one action or these couple of actions, and that's going to yield something, and we don't need to do the rest just to, check the boxes anymore, because we're there as a unit and we understand sort of how to create that advantage. That's my guess on what we're seeing now, is that they're doing less of this, preface action type stuff, because they know how to get into their sets quickly, and they know how to identify the opportunity to create an advantage.
I love the way you said that, because that's something I've tried to illustrate for years, and I never feel like I'm describing it particularly well. Quinn's layering over the course of multiple seasons. I think there are very few coaches in the league that do it this way, to be totally honest. And I think part of the reason he knows that he can is he has the knowledge with his front office that he's going to retain the same core of players year after year. So there's Joe Ingles, Rudy Gobert, Donovan Mitchell. He's been able to impart this stuff over years to these guys. And it's why I really feel like, especially when a group's in its second year, like this Jazz group is, I might make a crazy prediction soon about how many games the Jazz are going to win this year. I think they're going to win a ton of games. We don't know how that'll work out in the postseason. I'm saving my judgments on that, but I think they're going to win an absolutely ridiculous amount of regular season games, in part because of what we're talking about. It just becomes more reflexive with each year. And I like the way you kind of put that. So let's transition just a bit in terms of I just wanted to put it very broadly, who we've liked and who we've maybe perhaps been a bit concerned about in the preseason, and not even necessarily who, trends,
What?
things
Yeah.
you've seen, what can work as well. I've got mine here, but I'll ask you first, either a player, a trend, a thing, do one each, one that you like and one that you've been a little concerned by in the preseason.
Yeah, well, so back to the whole preseason caveat. And look, I get what you're saying about like overcorrecting on that, but at the same time, Chris Paul has played he played 17 minutes in one of the two games and didn't play in the other. Now Devin Booker's played a lot closer to regular, like other guys have played. So I'm not saying let's toss out the sample, but I am looking more, rather than looking at outcomes, I'm more looking at how do guys look? How is that flow feeling? And I think to that point, I would point to as the most encouraging trend, I would point to what you mentioned in your great video that you dropped today, which is the favors effect. I think by and large, the biggest thing that hurt the Jazz rotation last year is the fact that they tried, God bless them. They went out and they tried to get a player in Ed Davis that would allow them to run roughly the same system when Rudy sat. And then they got Ed in here and they figured out that just wasn't going to work because he didn't have the aptitude to be a last line type defender. And then they tried it with Tony Bradley and again, kept the system the same. So like all of the guards and perimeter defenders were supposed to do the same things when Tony was in as when Rudy was in. And you could tell that they mentally knew that, but you could tell that they were also just hesitant. And as they were closing out hard the 3-point shooters, they were going, I know I'm supposed to do this, but geez, that's Tony Bradley back there. That's not Rudy Gobert, right? And so I think that was the biggest thing I noticed over the course of last season is just this hesitancy to keep pushing things and to be as balls to the wall defensively as the Jazz want their perimeter defenders to be, because they didn't have confidence in what was behind them. And now I think, again, I'm not even saying this looking at stats because I don't really frankly care about preseason stats, but just watching the way that they play, watching the way that they chase guys off the 3-point line, and do so confidently and vigorously, and know that Favors is back there. I think that's just, for all the reasons you said in your video, I think it's just going to make a huge difference for the Jazz mentally and structurally and systemically. And I think that's probably been my most encouraging trend.
That's fair. Yeah, and thank you for the shout out on the video. It's interesting. I made the video, but that wasn't one of my key ones. I had two. My first is Mie Oni, which we're going to talk about the deep rotation, so I'll save comments there for that. And the other is actually the other guy we've spent most of this podcast talking about. I've been really impressed by Rudy Gobert.
Yeah.
Especially for a guy who knows that he's in negotiations for a contract. Obviously, as he says, he leaves that to his agent. And I think Rudy is serious when he says that. Like, he's one of those guys that legitimately leaves it to his agent. And there's a lot of, by the way, of confidence within the Jazz that no matter what happens here, whether they end up getting a deal done by the 21st or not, they're getting real Rudy for this season. He's not going to pout. He's not going to pull a James Harden. None of that is going to be happening, that they're going to get 100% maximum Rudy. And I'll just say, so you're right completely that the biggest problem last year, as I said in my video, was the backup interior defense in the bench unit by far. I also think quietly that another secondary reason why the Jazz were not a top 10 defense last year for the first time in Quinn Snyder's tenure since his first year was that, as we noted earlier, at times Rudy was not, I guess peak Rudy might be the right term, whatever you want to say. We noted it throughout the year. There were times where it looked like he was maybe pouting a little bit about not getting lobs on the other end of the floor, maybe not given 1,000,000% effort, which we're used to from him defensively as a result. I noticed that maybe a little more than I think some other people did. I expect a really high level out of Rudy from what he's shown us over a long period of time. And I think we're seeing that pretty significantly here during the early parts of this preseason, not in the results. You mentioned, stats can be misleading. At 20 rebounds in the game against Phoenix. I don't really care about that. Right. It's cool, but I don't really care about it. I care more about what I'm seeing from him, the energy level he's playing with. There were a couple defensive plays in that second game against Phoenix where he was scrambling to scram back on a switch after he had, when he saw a window for it. That was the kind of stuff he wasn't doing for a lot of those stretches last year. He was just like, I'm going to leave it. I can deal with it. He's Rudy Gobert. He knows he can defend a switch. He's liked my tweets about him defending switches all the time, So with all that put together, I've been really impressed by Rudy and what he's brought. And on the flip side, I'm a little concerned about Joe Ingles. Are you?
I wasn't going to say Joe. I think the tricky thing with Joe is we still haven't seen him look his best when he's playing with all of the offensive threats, right? I think that for Joe, one of the problems is he has a certain style. He kind of defers by nature. So how can he have an impact when he's on the floor with Mike, when he's on the floor with Bogey, when he's on the floor with Donovan? Now, he might be on the floor with those guys less because I think the plan is to bring him off the bench, but I do think he'll be a frequent closer. And I do think that lineup of, basically Mike, Don, Joe, Bogey, Rudy, I think that lineup is going to have to be, that's going to be an important lineup. It's a lineup that was plus 23 net rating over the first month of last season. And then Mike was playing hurt. And then by the time Mike got back, Bogey was playing hurt. And so they ended the year like -8 or -9 or something like that. But I do think that lineup is better than what their net rating from last season suggests. And Joe's a big part of that. My one that I was going to say I'm concerned about, and again, process versus results. I could care less, especially in a preseason game. If Donovan Mitchell goes 0 for 22 in a preseason game and he's like playing the right way and doing the right things, and I don't care about his percentage in that context. I do think that, as you pointed out in your sort of Where's Donovan video, I think it was your first video, right? It was the one that launched, the channel. Yeah, as you pointed out in that one, like the big question for Donovan and for understanding where the Jazz are as a function of Donovan's, is Donovan top 25? Like he's empirically top 25 because he was an all-star, right? Is he still top 25, or now is he top 15 because of the leap he made in the playoffs, or is he top 10, or does he give some of that back because he's not going to sustain some of the crazy off the bounce shooting and some of the wild, 70% true shooting that he had against Denver in that series? And so that's where, just seeing him slide back to where some of his shots, I don't love the mental process. I don't love the percentages either. But again, it's not about percentages. It's about, hoping to see him open the regular season closer to where he ended last postseason.
Yeah, I would. I didn't have him listed, but I would agree with that as well. For me, the biggest thing is he's just looked rushed, which has been a thing for him at points through his career. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest kind of obstacles he fights through, and not just being rushed, but almost that feeling of like, I got to do something. I got to make something happen. I got almost the thought of like, I got to win this game here on this possession, even though it's the middle of the third quarter. You can't win the game on that possession. That's not how it works. Like there were several moments in that second Phoenix game. He had a rough shooting game and he was turning the ball over and just going a little too fast. I have high hopes that that's just a bit of like, maybe it's a bit of bubble carryover from the simple urgency that there was in the bubble. And I don't blame him for that. Like he was playing with an incredible amount of urgency there. It might be tough to step back on the court for your first competitive games and just kick that out of your system all of a sudden. So I'll give him some time, but I'll agree with you. It's at least a minor concern.
Well, or it could be, frankly, we just talked about how Quinn's in guys' ears about making decisions faster and playing faster. So that could be part of what's speeding him up, even though I'm sure that what Quinn means by that is not, step across midcourt and throw something up. Not that that's what Donovan's doing, but like this stuff is nuanced. And, especially for a young player to hear your coach say, go faster, make decisions faster. That doesn't mean speed up your decision, speed up your mental read on what's happening on the floor. Like he still needs to have command of the game, and I think he will. I'm not the least bit worried about Donovan. I think Donovan's a special player. I think his trajectory is going to continue upward in a general sense. So I'm not saying any of this because I think that 2 preseason games reframe the conversation around where he's headed as a player and as a superstar. I'm just saying I would feel more comfortable about those heady projections if he looked a little bit more like he did in August. That's all.
For sure. Yeah. And like, it's funny. One of the turnovers I was mentioning from that Phoenix game was he was literally just trying to run up the court faster than normal and just lost the ball. Like that
Yep.
could easily be exactly what you're talking about. Like he's maybe taking it a little too much to heart from Quinn.
Right.
So the last thing that we wanted to kind of go over here, and it's right down the lines of these preseason reactions that we have, is I think, as I mentioned at the start, we have a pretty good idea of who the top 8 are for the Jazz on this roster. Let's see if I can list them off the top of my head. Wow, okay. Donovan.
Yeah, start with Ingles. Why not?
I'll start with Ingles. Donovan, Conley, Ingles, Gobert, Favors, Bogdanovich,
Clarkson.
That was only 7 though. There's one more.
And Royce,
of course, yeah, because he hasn't played, so it's good that it's justifiable that we forgot about him for a second. That's the top 8. When those 8 are healthy, though, all of those 8 will be in the rotation. I think there's pretty much no question about that.
Absolutely.
Quinn, as we've seen over the last couple of years, likes to run at least 9, if not maybe 9.5-ish to 10 guys in his rotation. And when I talk about rotation, just so people know, I'm usually thinking around like an average of 15 minutes a game, or guys that we know are going to be on the court each night as part of Quinn's standard lineups. So the really interesting question then is, assuming the 9 guys are healthy, which will not be the case, or the 8 are healthy for the whole year, which probably won't be the case for the entire year, especially in this very unique season. A, who do we think is the 9th? And B, what do we think is maybe the pecking order after that if guys get hurt or if someone has a COVID absence, which I think it's a really interesting question, because in a large case or in a large number of circumstances, it's going to depend on who's the guy that's out. In terms of, like, if Favors has to miss some time, obviously Doak is probably going to be the one who jumps up to play the backup center minutes. But if Bogdanovich gets hurt for a while, who's the guy that comes up in there? I'm really interested just by your general thoughts. I was on the record on the podcast with him last week, George Niang, not just because he's my guy, but also as I think he's going to start the year as the 9th man. And I think he's going to play some backup 4 in those backup units with Favors as the center. But I'm not sure of that. I just think that. And I'm really interested by what happens from there and if things change. And just give me your general thoughts. I don't have a really good question for you.
Well, here's what Niang has going for him. Niang has been around long enough and has been doing this in the NBA and for the Jazz specifically, that he doesn't have to think about what happens next, right? We were just talking about Quinn building this reflexive muscle memory into the guys, and when I've seen Niang go in there and play with the young guys in like the fourth quarters of these preseason games, what I notice is that he's the guy who doesn't have to think, right? He's just sort of flowing through actions and kind of on autopilot in a good way. And I think that does make him a pretty safe default choice. Now, what I would say is that I think the 4 guys who are next in that pecking order are all they're all like perimeter-ish players, right? Meaning like, Morgan and Niang are technically bigs, but they're like stretch 4 bigs. They're not anchor bigs. And I think the Jazz flex enough of what they do 1 through 4 that it kind of like if Clarkson had to miss a game, you could replace Clarkson's minutes with Morgan if you wanted to, and just flex the way you're using Royce and Joe and some other guys. Like I think that's true. I do think where you're right about situational is obviously if Gobert or Favors misses a game, you're bringing Doak in to play 15 or 20 minutes in the rotation. But other than that, I think that you can plug and play a lot of different ways with Niang, Juwan Morgan, Miye Oni, and Shaq Harrison. Now, we haven't seen Shaq yet, and you know that I'm a believer in Shaq. I think Shaq, so is John Hollinger, by the way, so are a lot of people. Zach Lowe wrote a piece where he called Shaq one of the players that he thinks will have a breakout season because he thinks he's better than he looked statistically last season, and I agree with that. But then we've also heard crazy positive things about Morgan and Oni. So every time I think I'm starting to get a sense of how Quinn has these guys mentally prioritized, something happens that makes me rethink everything, like a nice game by Oni in game 2, or the nice game that Morgan had in game 1, or just the way that it is a little bit more effortless and automatic for Niang. And then I remember who Shaq is. So I don't know how that's going to play out. In fact, I think my prediction with those 4 spots is I think it might be more of kind of an ever shifting totem pole. Like my siblings and I like to joke that the 6 of us are on a totem pole of my mom's favorites, and we move up or down depending on how much we help her with stuff and how often we visit. And I think it might be that kind of thing where maybe it is Niang for games 1 through X. And then, someone else has a chance to play their way in front of him, either by kicking butt in practice or, the other thing about the Jazz is you're right about the 9-man rotation, but whoever is 10 and 11, those guys are going to get chances to play because someone's going to get in foul trouble. Someone's going to miss a night. Someone's going to struggle.
You know what else is going to happen?
The COVID thing.
No, not even just that.
Oh, okay.
We already mentioned that, but going along with my previous line about I think the Jazz are going to win a lot of games. I think they're going to blow a lot of crappy teams out.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to spend a lot of fourth quarters getting to play these guys and see what they can do. And that might be Quinn's way of finding out who's really in these spots.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so yeah, all of those guys 9 through 12, and I'm sorry to Hughes and to Doak, I think that they're probably going to be on the outside looking in at first, Brantley and Forrest, I think are, because they're on 2-way deals, I think that's a little different. We'll see. One thing that nobody's really talked about yet that I think is going to be interesting is because the G League is doing the bubble environment this season, I think you're going to see less of guys shuttling back and forth. And that's going to be interesting because you can't necessarily play Brantley with the Stars on a Tuesday night and then dress him with the Jazz on a Wednesday night. And so the Jazz might just decide that for those two guys, it's more, and frankly, maybe even for Hughes, right? They might just decide that it's more important to them that they get real burn and that they play and they develop. And even if that means sending them to the G League bubble for a while and forgetting about them. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm not as, how shall I say this delicately? I'm not as big on Brantley as, I think Jazz fans somehow got this wild crush on Brantley, and I don't know exactly what he did to deserve it. I think Brantley is firmly a 2-way player. I think he's firmly a fringe NBA talent. These other guys we're talking about are NBA talents and maybe fringe rotation talents. I think the tier is different, and I would venture to say that it's going to be those 4 guys mostly vying for the 9th role, and then the minutes that open up in the 10th and 11th man roles.
I agree with you on Brantley. First of all, his best skills are the ones that require you to have the ball a lot, and he's not good enough at those to get it over the actual guys who should have the ball on the NBA court, unfortunately. Just a quick word that I'll give on Miye Oni, because I mentioned that I wanted to talk about him earlier.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. I've been a big fan. That's not just a preseason.
Yeah, I know.
Everyone knows I've been a big fan going way, I think back to the night that he was drafted, which is when I found out who he was, because I don't do draft research much anymore. But once I found out the template of the player, I talked to a few people that watched him significantly at Yale. And I've made the prediction both in DMs and I believe on my actual Twitter to Tony that I think Miye Oni is going to push, if not take, those minutes from Shaq Harrison that you were mentioning, because I think he's going to I've watched a lot of tape on Shaq, and I'm a fan too, to be clear. I like the guy. I thought he was a great signing. And I think that it's going to turn into one of those good problems for the Jazz where both guys are very good options. But I think, having watched plenty of both recently, and with my optimism about Oni, I really think his speed is the biggest thing for me. That guy is so fast. He gets beat sometimes. Everybody gets beat. There's no guy in the NBA that doesn't get beat off the dribble every once in a while. The speed with which he recovers and the effort level that he has for that recovery is incredible. He's a good, capable 3-point shooter. Yeah, he can do a little off the bounce, although I don't think that's going to be his primary role. I see this guy as a Royce O'Neal 2.0 in a lot of ways, and I'm a really big fan, and I think he's going to force Quinn to play him some of the, like, I'm really interested in those jitterbug guards. Like we saw Royce have some trouble with Jamal Murray in the play. I mean, everybody had trouble with Jamal Murray in the playoffs last year, but Royce's thing before that was kind of like he can guard those quick twitch guys. He had a little bit of an issue with that. Not that I'm saying Miye would have necessarily changed the game. I don't think anybody was dealing with Jamal the way he was, but those types of guys, those quicker guys, I'm really interested to see if Miye might become a reliable, dependable piece for Quinn there.
Frankly, I'm interested to see Shaq in those kinds of situations too, especially when you mentioned Murray. Like Murray's a guard, and I think Shaq is, maybe that's his best defensive position is the 1 or the 2. He can guard most threes reasonably well, whereas Oni I think is bigger and longer, and But yeah, I mean, both those guys, I mean, it's exactly what you said. It's a good problem, right? It's the Jazz having depth. If you want to get really provocative here for a minute, like there's been all this talk about, are the Jazz maybe keeping their options open so that they have a way in March to get out of the tax if they want to get out of the tax?
There's been that talk between the Clayton brothers, at least.
Yeah, basically between the Clayton brothers.
Everybody. But it is important.
I mean, hey, other people are weighing in. So,
and it matters, by the way, because for folks who don't understand, if the Jazz are in the luxury tax this year and then want to go in future years, then there's repeater tax and it adds up. So it matters.
Yeah. So the Jazz, after they make the expected cuts of their Exhibit 10 guys, they will start the season $2 million into the tax. There's a way they can get under the tax in March. It involves giving up the 13th and 14th man depth, and going into the final stretch, the final 52-day stretch of the season. A little bit compromised in your deep bench, which may or may not matter because, last season at least, Quinn barely touched the very end of his roster. So, but if you want to get really provocative here for a minute, what if that's not the way the Jazz get into the tax? What if get out of the tax? What if the way they get out of the tax is because Oni plays his way to a point where suddenly, or like, hey, Hughes has looked pretty impressive as a scorer and just an instinctual. Now, I don't expect Hughes to contribute a lot in year one, but doesn't he kind of look like a Jordan Clarkson light right now?
And
so like, young. What if
he's like 22? He's not like he's a 19-year-old jumping.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think that a possibility that at least needs to be entertained is, what if one of these guys that right now, we consider the Jazz as having a really firm top 8 and then a drop off and then some nice deep bench type guys. What if one of those deep bench type guys is better than we think and starts to play in such a way that the Jazz suddenly feel like they could move off maybe a bigger contract and, trade one of those guys and bring back less money. And that's how they get under the tax. And that's how they address maybe the asset situation and the tax situation for the next couple of years. Now, again, like eventually, if you want to contend, you're probably going to pay the tax at some point. But you're right. The Jazz don't want to pay the tax until they're sure they have a contending team, because it just, especially for a small market team and the repeater tax, it's not sustainable to do it year after year after year. And take on those penalties, to say nothing of the fact that even if you're over the tax by $1, the real cost of being over by that dollar is that you don't get any of the disbursement that comes from the tax-paying teams. So that in a regular year probably costs a tax-paying team $6 to $10 million. So even if you're over by $1, that dollar just costs you $6 to $10 million. And so the Jazz, I think, will they'll keep their options open. I think they'll see how competitive they feel like they are in March. They'll see what they're getting out of those 12, 13, 14 roster spots. They'll see what might be available on the buyout market, and that'll dictate some of the decision-making too on if they, offload a low salary guy and then sign a rest of season contract with someone. Those are all possibilities, but if you want to be a little provocative, another possibility is that maybe the pecking order as we imagine it today is not what the pecking order is 4 months from now.
And if that's the case, you could be looking, again, we're being provocative and hypothetical here, but you could be looking at a situation where that turns itself into also an upgrade for your team. If it turns out Juwan Morgan or Miaoni is just as good of an option as one of these guys we're talking about, you can move one of those guys at his salary. You're not going to get nothing back. You'll probably take some futures back, but you'll probably get a player or two. You got to match the salary and everything or come close. Like, it would not surprise me at all if that was the kind of thing. And I know that lots of Jazz fans will hear this and think, you don't want Jazz fans hate trading anybody that plays even 5 minutes for their team. So and
the Jazz like their guys. I mean, the Jazz like these 8 guys, and they've spent a lot of time building their, it took them, they had to do the cap space here to bring Conley over and Bogey. And then they had to wait for exceptions to bring Favors back and re-sign Jordan and trades along the way and all this stuff. It has taken a long time to construct an 8-man core that they feel this good about. I don't think they will be in a hurry to dismantle that thing that they've built that they're so proud of. But again, I think if someone can come in and disrupt what we think is the top 8 pecking order, then maybe they feel like they have some freedom that they otherwise might not have had. Maybe.
We'll leave it there for Jazz fans to hypothesize further and get mad at us for even suggesting the thought of trading a certain player. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining me. Guys, once again, head over to Salt City Hoops and find Dan's recent piece on Rudy Gobert, which was as good of a primer as you'll read heading into these next few days, and even beyond those if Rudy does not sign within these next few days. You can follow Dan on Twitter at Dan Clayton, except the O is a 0. You can follow me on Twitter at Ben_Dowsett, Dowsett. Please subscribe to the Jazz Film Room Patreon. It's $1.99 a month, guys. An expensive donut. Buy me an expensive.
It's like a Diet Coke.
Yeah, it's a large Diet Coke from certain play. I mean, I hope nobody's really charging $1.99 for soda these days, but like $1.99 is not very much. Please support me so I can keep making these podcasts, the videos that I've been making. I've been really enjoying it. I hope I can keep doing it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, Jazz Film Room. That really helps me out as well. And then, Dan, anything to promote besides your Rudy Gobert piece, which we have promoted significantly?
There's just lots of great work lately at Salt City Hoops. I think we have a more energized staff these days than we've maybe had in a minute. So, there's good stuff. There's, just keep coming and checking us out and supporting the good work of the staff there at Salt City Hoops.
Absolutely. I love seeing my alma mater do great things. And Dan's right there. It's been fantastic content on the site recently. So guys, Salt City Hoops, Dan Clayton, Ben Dowsett, Jazz Film Room. Thank you so much for tuning into the Jazz Film Room podcast. Have a great one.